I'm Cindy Kelly, Atomic Heritage Foundation. It is Monday, May 28, 2018, in Antony, France, and I have with me Helene Langevin-Joliot.
My name is Hélène. The name of my husband was Langevin, so I am Hélène Langevin and Joliot. I was a young girl in a scientific family. I became a scientist. I have a number of ideas. I engage in politics, not in politics every day, but in political idea, as my father, but at a smaller level. So I spend all my time studying nuclear physics until and after my retreat. So I stopped scientific research 10 years ago completely. Okay.
Well, that's wonderful. I want to come back to more of your story, but first let's go back 2 generations and talk about your grandparents, Marie and Pierre.
I have never met Pierre Curie, who died in 1906 in an accident, a street accident. I was 7 when Marie died. But it's true that I have a slight feeling of my grandmother as when I was a child. But I wish to say that not so much, and the reason is simple. In the family, including Marie, as in many families, the important person is not the grandmother, it is the children. You understand what I mean? In a family, the children is the most important person. So I have read about her. I have heard my parents speaking about Marie and our love of science. I remember my parents saying, oh, she was a very good director of the Radium Institute after the French War. And but they had some time. Okay, she was really a very good director, but it happened that she took the good decision at that time, that day. She was not always right every day. You see, it's a how to say? It's a life, it's not a myth. So I see Marie, my Pierre, it's slightly more difficult because in all time, as, okay, exceptional person, but also in the life of other people are. So they are nearer to me. They are not mythical person.
Right. So, tell us about her background. Was she born in France? Where is Marie from?
Marie was born in Poland, in Warsaw, in a family with several children. She was the younger one. The family was, I would not say poor, but with poor, rather, but with a very high level of education. Her father and her mother. And At that time, Warsaw was in the Russian Empire. And the situation when she was a girl was very difficult because there have been protestation in Poland, so the situation was she cannot study in Polish, she was obliged to do that in Russian. After that, the question was she wished to enter a university. She was a very good student. But at that time, women were not accepted in Warsaw University. So her sister wished to become a doctor. She don't know exactly what she wished, but she wished something about science. And but the question going abroad, her father has not enough money to help. So they combined. The elder sister go to France first, study medicine. Marie decide to become a governess, a tutor of children in rich Polish family. It was sometimes not so bad, but sometimes rather difficult. And finally, she succeeded several years after. She was 24 when she came to Paris, and under easily the Sorbonne University. It was more easy for her than for a French student, because French women don't got at that time the baccalaureate. So it was very difficult to enter the university. Marie have a certificate from the Russian Empire, and that certificate was at the level of the baccalaureate. So it was accepted to enter. It's not special. You as in physics and mathematics about the same amount of French and foreign students at that time for women.
So how many women were there at that time?
I would say it depends if you take all the university or not, and it was changing every year, because it was the period, what I call a transition period, where you start from 0, then 1, 2, 3, 10, more or less 20, and the year after there were 25, and so on. So it was increasing at that, but it was a small number. The total number of students was very small, 2,000, something like that, 2,000 or 3,000, and the women were 20, 30, 50, maybe, depending of the year you point.
So she was clearly a minority.
Oh, okay, more than a minority. A special situation that changing rather quickly if you compare with the situation at the beginning of the 19th century, when one.
So she was a good student.
Very good. Very good. And when, okay, she has success in Paris, first in physics, then in mathematics. Then she got she had decided to come back to Poland to try to find a position to teach. But it happens that, the French professor of physics, Lippmann, was impressed by this Polish student, and she found for her a research contract to make some measurements, some rather easy, in principle, some easy measurement about the magnetic property of steels. And it is when she wished to start that work, that she met Pierre Curie, who at that time have a lot of research result, very important. Already she have been involved with he have discovered piezoelectricity with his mother 20 years before. She have produced a theoretical paper about symmetry, and he was finishing his thesis about magnetic property, the first important thing after Faraday on the subject, or nearly that. And they met. And it happens that Pierre Curie at first decides that he will make everything to become his husband. So it was difficult for Marie to decide, because Poland or France. And they exchanged letters, very beautiful letters. In fact, the letters from Pierre Curie were successful to decide her to remain in France and remain with him. Okay, he wrote something like that. It will be a beautiful thing to spend our life together with our humanitarian life, and also your patriotic life, and our scientific lives. And okay, she married. Marie studied and was able, in principle, she could have a teaching position in France, and then she decided it's better to try research and to try to have a thesis on that. And they discuss about what subject, and they choose the discovery of Henri Becquerel of the uranium radiation. And it is the starting point. The starting point of the two discoveries between September 1897, she started arranging the apparatus with Pierre, because a system was built by him, and she started measurement. She studied uranium. It is radiation. Uranium radiation is really an atomic radiation. And she has the idea to compare, to see if other element, chemical element, have the same property, not so much, one. And then she has the idea to look again at minerals, and was very much surprised that pitchblende and another one were more active, as it is written in the publication, than uranium. And then they became to work together, Pierre and Marie. And by the end of 1898, they have discovered first polonium in July and radium in December. And there was a note of the French Academy of Science just before polonium. The first note was signed only by Marie. And you may understand, but many physicists would have signed the note with Marie. All the experimental setup was from Pierre. And they decide, probably, maybe he decided that it was better. He was already known as a physicist. I am sure that the fact that this first note has been signed by Marie alone was the starting point of all our career, because you cannot say it's Pierre. And after that, it's true that the two discoveries, they work together and they are their common discovery. For her thesis, she found very important that it was not only to use the work they have done together about polonium and radium, but to go further, so that to have a pure, to get to have radium as a pure salt, because end of 98, it was trace. The things they have succeeded to produce, where you have not one part in 100 of radium, for example, in the barium salt. So it was at work for at least 4 years. Very difficult, with a huge amount of pitch blend of all that. It must be said that, okay, they never have 4 tons of pitch blende in the lab. It was completely impossible. So Pierre Curie arranged to ask a external society to make the beginning, to treat the beginning of this huge mass of pitch blende, but they have they have tens of kilos to have to process, and it was already enough. So the Nobel Prize in 1903 was given for physics to Becquerel and Pierre and Marie Curie, divided in 2. The reason was that the Nobel Committee received first a French proposal for Becquerel and Pierre Curie, without Marie. And Pierre was aware of that, and he wrote to saying that on this work it was necessary to have Marie included, and she was.
Tell us about the hazards of working for 3 or 4 years with these huge vats of pitch blende. How dangerous was that?
It was dangerous because of radioactivity increasing and increasing. When she have at the end a few, yes, 1 decigram or less of radium, it can a lot of radiation in that, and no special mean for chemistry in this place. But they have their finger burned, you see. But at that time, people not know so much about the risk of cancer, in fact. So they start to start to be aware of that, maybe 15 or 20 years after. And it's Pierre Curie who at that time begin to have some collaboration with medical people. We try to use radium to cure, yes.
Cure cancer?
Not immediately cancer, but seen with some special problems on the face, and okay. So it destroyed. Radium was destroying things, so it was possible to use first for skin problems, and then they say, okay, maybe we can try on cancer to cure cancer. But it, the medical people need 20 years to be able to start, I would say, scientific, really scientific trial with measurement of the radiation, looking at the result and so on. At the beginning, it was just people are dying, we try something.
I have read the laboratory where they worked was part of the School of Medicine once. It was a morgue.
Yes, but it was, okay. Pierre Curie was a professor at the School for Chemistry and Physics, a school for engineers. The place of the school was organized before from a public school, more general. And in a part there was some older and older place, which have been not a medical school, but a place with some medical trying. But it was old and not convenient at all as a laboratory. That was the point. And it was a reason that Pierre was trying to get a real laboratory. And after he died, Marie takes the work. And she asked, and so the Nobel Prize helped, but it take a long time before the Faculty of Science in Paris and the Pasteur Institute agree to start the building of a radium institute. There was already at that time a radium institute in Wien. So, and the radium institute in France was just finished at the beginning of the First War. And there was in the Radium Institute a part for chemistry and physics directed by Marie, and a part for biology and medicine directed by a very important, very good researcher, Claude Regaud. So they combined. It happens that during the First War, Marie decided it was not time to start study on radioactivity at the Radium Institute, that she devoted completely her time and her effort for radiology tests for the soldiers. So she was not in other countries, the same thing happened. Liz Meitner, for example, do the same thing. But Marie, with energy, was able to, convince the military stage, convince medical people. We think that take searching for peace in the that X-rays were not so useful, and they don't understand how to use X-rays. She was able to convince them. She searched for people to help, and my mother, who have 17 years, start to help. And so just after the war, Marie was a director of a lab. She increased the lab. She developed the Radium Institute. And between the end of the French War and her death in 1934, she makes the Radium Institute one of the main laboratories in the world. Yes, 2 or 3 were maybe comparable to that. So she have to get money, especially during the first year after the end of the war, because France was in a very poor situation. And it happens that this journalist, Mrs. Melanie, was successful to get an interview from Marie, which was amazing, because she never gave interview. And Mrs. Melanie was successful to get one. And it happens that instead of asking Marie how that she was very unhappy with that and that and that, she asked the situation about the lab. And immediately Marie answered. And they discussed together. Interview, she don't imagine an interview for that. And it was the starting point of this petition for money to pay for 1 gram radium to Marie, and the trip in America to get that rad in 1921. I would say this travel probably make more or the same level than the Nobel Prize. It was a promotion, an exceptional promotion.
It was something.
And it's true that things were it was built on serious things, but I am not sure that without that travel, Marie would have been known as much as she was in those times and after, because the 2 trips in the States in 21 and 29, with all the publicity and all the newspapers speaking about it, that gives the idea of an important editor just after Marie's death, to ask to F. Curie to write a biography of Marie, So, so that biography has been was in English, published in English earlier than in French, in spite of the fact that it was translated from French. And yes, it was very important for the spreading of the book, because the book was known even more in English, in speaking English people than in France, the number of people. Yes. Okay. So you find, there have been other books about Marie after the Second War. And several of them at the beginning were people by historians, because the archive began to be open. So many things that my aunt was unable to know about. It's true. For example, this story about the first Nobel Prize, nobody knows until historian opens the archive of the Nobel Committee. It was not immediately after the war. It was much later. So you have serious work written about Marie. And also some books for children of summaries and all that. And now Marie has become really a symbol of the myth about women in science, and a number of books are written. Okay, I read some of them. I discuss with the writers in some cases, and you have a lot of books I've never know about. Some are good, some are interesting, or you arrange the life of Marie so that it became some new things, a roman, which have in some case nothing to do with the truth. It's like that. So, if you wish to know about Marie, I will make a publicity for a book I take care of, for the publication I take care of, with the director of the museum, of the Curie Museum. We have gathered part of the letter exchange between Marie Curie and her daughters, Irène and Eve. You have 100 letters. You have 1,000 of letters in total. So that's really the true Marie Curie. You find in that.
That's great. Can you go back a little bit on the World War I, when she used X-rays? Was that the first time they were used in war? Or in hospitals even, to detect where the bullet might be or the broken bones? Was that the first time that X-rays were used for that purpose?
X-rays have been used before the First War in hospital and that, but not so much. All in France, but also in Germany, in England, and all that place. It was the beginning of the use of X-rays. So, as the war started, it was not long to see that a number of soldiers with which needed X-ray was huge. And Marie appreciated that immediately in the first weeks of the war. So she thought that she could do something on that. She searched for car to be able to change the things, so that to put X-ray apparatus and use to. She became to teach to medical people so that, and women, so that they were able to use the X-ray apparatus at the time were laboratory apparatus.
Do you remember what people have called those ambulances she fixed with the X-ray apparatus? Do you know the term petite Curie?
Yes.
Can you
to
say
tell
that?
the truth, Marie organized this petite Curie, so this car. It must be said that during the war, when the military stage were convinced that it was really needed, there were a huge number of those cars, and those cars are not the Petit Curie, but okay.
Great.
Yes.
That's great.
Not all. And you have Petite Curie in Germany. Because, okay, it was obvious at some time, even the military understood that it was necessary.
That's great. That's great. Let's see. One other image I have of Marie and Pierre on their honeymoon. Is it true they went on a bicycle trip in Brittany? And can you tell us about how much they like to bicycle?
Yes, they love trips in the countries with bicycle or by feet. They thought it was very important for children not only to study, but also to take good health and so on. And this is a tradition which came to the next generation. So more than people used to do in those times. So you have a number of things like that. And they were not always at the laboratory. It happens that they may come back at the night to continue some operation of to look at the result. But at other time, okay, they take some vacation. You may ask a question between the discovery of polonium and radium. They know that there was another element than polonium to discover. And what does they do? They take vacation. And they spend in vacation more than 1 month, or maybe 2, if you look at the mention in the notebook. It's completely incredible for a scientist in our time. Okay, you have made a discovery, you know that another one to do, and you stop everything to go and take vacation, and took care of the young children and so on. Among the many things, many ideas which came from the Pierre and Marie to my parents, and I would say to me and my brother, was, I would say, the love of science, of research. an idea about the fact that everybody need good condition of life. At each generation, they hope that more people are more happy with better social condition. This was something from one generation to the other in different conditions, because the time of Marie and Pierre is not the same as my time, for example. And also the fact that children, boy and girl, I would say my parents, because for Marie and Pierre it was two girls, but for my parents, boy and girl, okay, they need the same kind of teaching, the same kind of education, and all the family need not to be always working at the lab or at the school, but need to have vacation, to do sport, to, I would say, active way of having taking their time for active vacation, I would say. So all that was transmitted from one generation to the other. So my parents, they have not to come from one country to the other. Frederic Joliot and Irène Curie were both born in Paris. Irène was born in a scientific family, and she was quickly interested in science, and I would say she dropped in science quite naturally. For Frederic Joliot, it's completely different, because his family have no connection at all with science. Maybe some artists, they love very much theater and all that. They have money before the First War. It was a rather big family, but okay, two girls. So, my father and older a brother. The family was rather rich. The father, okay, rentier, was nothing. Okay, have money with not working for money for a long time. And my father was okay. He go to the school. He was in the middle of not especially good. Chemistry is interesting, but football is very interesting also. And it happens that it was the First War. And the First War was not simple for the family. The older brother of my father died or disappeared, was lost in the first weeks of the war. And it was very important for my father, for the life of my father, during all the life of my father. The number of times he spoke about that. During that time, Irène was helping Marie in the Curie. So at the end, they have one thing in common. War is awful. So one thing, my father entered the school for chemistry and physics to become an engineer. The school was rather only 3 years. You don't need the complete baccalaureate to enter. You have a competition for entering. It was considered preparing an engineer for production, not researcher. But it happens that one of the professors was Paul Langevin. And physics by Paul Langevin was something much more than ordinary physics. And at the end, my father was the first in his promotion, if in the year of where he ended the school. He could have choose industry with a very good salary. And finally, he wished to try research. How? There was no position for that at all. Only very few positions. Not only for women, very few positions for everybody. And Paul Langevin, Marie asked Paul Langevin, do you know a young man, we could enter the Radium Institute as my preparator, a person helping me for both things, because my preparator is retiring. And Paul Langevin proposed Frederic Joliot, and it answers the Radium Institute in 2025. At that time, my mother was on the year where she finished her thesis. So you see, in that generation, the woman was the teaching person of my father. And a number of times he spoke about that, saying, okay, I don't like so much to be taught by a woman. And as my mother was not at all a diplomatic person, things were like that and that. She don't take any, okay, she just takes this wrong, this is wrong, this is, But this was not for long. Finally, these two people understood that they were with completely different characteristics. My father was speaking an exuberant young man, okay, rather happy with women, okay. My mother was, don't like to speak, only discussing with a few persons I know about, and okay, all that. But they understood, they were happy together working, they share the same kind of value, they were happy, okay, doing sports, they were happy with me. So, and they share, okay, the same idea, finally, about science. So, okay, my mother had her thesis in 25. My father had his thesis in 31. He had to complete the baccalaureate and, okay, take some teaching again for to be able to present a thesis, because the School of Chemistry and Physics at that time was not considered the equal level of the Sorbonne. So we thought take time, and starting 1929, they start to work together. And okay, we were living in Paris at that time, and they worked very much in what I call the marvelous years of radioactivity and nuclear physics. During those years, until the war, you have a number of steps taken in that field. Incredible. Incredible. And Irène Curie and Frederic Joliot, because they signed their paper like that. They never signed Joliot-Curie. When they published something, it was together, it was Irène Curie and Frederic Joliot, which was not used so much at the time. And they were not completely successful in all cases. One says that they have missed the discovery of the neutron. This is more or less true. The way my father presents that case much later, he says the discovery of neutron is a very good example that science is international. Because the starting point of the discovery of neutron is not only the experiment performed at the Radium Institute and the conclusion of my parents. It started 2 years before with the discovery by Bode and Becker in Germany of an extraordinary radiation able to travel a piece of lead, and all physicists in a conference thinking about that, and nobody understand what this radiation is, and the radiation being studied in the different place. My parents, more than 1 year after, start to work with that. It was a work where a secondary radiation was observed. And that gives them the idea of prepare the experiment to be able to search not only for neutron, which the radiation property, but to be able to look at the radiation, whatever it is. Because other people during that time, in Cambridge in particular, they were interested in the same problem. The radiation is able to cross lead. Why does I need a very thin window of the ionization chamber to look at that radiation? No reason. The experiment for my parents just decide to put a thin window. Not useful again, not useful for that radiation, but useful for the secondary radiations that they observe when they look at many foils of one element, another one, and they use a foil with a composition with hydrogen. The radiation, the very energetic radiation, crossing that very small foil, was able to project out hydrogen radiation, called protons after. And the conclusion my parents, when they published that, they say this, that, and they say the same thing that Bohr, that the other previous. This is due to gamma rays. At that time, people don't know about what happens to gamma rays when they are energetic gamma rays. The paper was arrived in Cambridge. Rutherford say, I don't trust that. But you have to check. Chadwick checked the day after it went convinced that it was true. And he performed marvelous experiment to prove without any doubt that it was a neutral particle. The neutral particle that Rutherford, 10 years before, I've quote about in a lecture, which was not the good one, because he looks at that, a special unknown force bringing together proton and electron to make a neutral particle. And the neutron is not that at all. So, you see the story. It's really an international story. And, okay, the neutron, I think it's incredible. In that year, 1932, in January, Urey discovered this deuterium. Next, Chadwick discovered neutron. In the summer, Anderson discovered the positive electron. Dirac predicts that antimatter may exist, but nobody has taken care of that. And Anderson discovered the positive electron in cosmic rays, in the rays coming from space. What is that? And all physicists tried to look in the lab, and they understood that they have already seen positive electron without recognizing them. So, the years after, everybody looked at electron positive, production of electron positive, understood that that came from gamma rays. And during 1 year and a half, okay, in all the lab on radioactivity, people were working on neutron, nuclear reaction producing neutron, and various ways of producing positive electrons. And this was the way that my parents were working on that during all the year 33. At the fall, this very important meeting, discussion, the Solvay Council, a special meeting organized by Ernest Solvay, who is a very rich man from all, it was an industrial people. And he invited the better physicists in the world to discuss on the problem. So the subject in 33 was the structure of atom. And okay, it happens that my parents present the result, and the result was, okay, a nuclear reaction producing neutron, but they not understood. It was very difficult to understand how this was possible. And the same reaction seems to produce also positive electrons. And nobody understood. And my parents say, okay, it's simpler. It's another ordinary nuclear reaction, but sometimes protons give a neutron and electron positive together. And that way. Everybody was don't appreciate the idea. It was theoretically very bad. Lise Meitner said, I don't see neutrons. It was a controversy. They came back to the lab, rather unhappy. And finally, they understood in January that the process was in 2 steps. You have an ordinary reaction first, From aluminium, you have a reaction giving phosphor, but this phosphor was radioactive. So it was impossible to understand because you have to say you produce not a stable nucleus but a radioactive one. So it was, they can publish 2 papers, one, a new type of radioactivity, emitting a positive electron, then in radioactivity, artificial radioactivity. This produced artificial radioactivity, and the Nobel Prize for chemistry was given because they were able to isolate, to prove that it was they have produced phosphorus in that reaction, and in another one they have produced a radioactive nitrogen. When we think to radioactivity, artificial radioactivity, is one of the discovery with, okay, the day after people got the publication, a number of physicists were able to see that radioactivity exists. It was incredible. It may have been discovered much earlier. And my parents were especially happy when Rutherford sent them small, saying, "I have searched a long time for such a phenomenon." This was a turning point in their life, because a few months later, the discovery, Marie Curie died. She has seen the experiment, so probably she knows that she would get the Nobel Prize, but she died in July. And a new director in the Radium Institute, in spite of the fact that the neutron, the property of gamma ray, artificial radioactivity has been discovered by sending alpha ray projectiles from radioactive polonium and all that. In the lab, accelerator of particles start to be built. None of these accelerators play a role in this big discovery. But it was clear that the future of nuclear physics cannot continue using alpha particles for polonium source. So you need more energy, different particles, and all that. So it was a reason for my parents to separate. They don't work together after. They discuss together a lot, but they don't work together. My mother remained at the Radium Institute. My father, who have got a position in not the center, the National Center for Research, but something before. But okay, he have a position not very high, but he started to try to build accelerator in a new lab, an industrial one, especially because he was convinced that radioactive isotopes will become very important in many applications, and especially for biology and medicine. and he started to collaborate on that subject, not nuclear physics. On the same time, preparing things for a nuclear physics lab, because he was named as a professor at the Collège de France, which is a very high-level position. But himself, the time he had to make research was about using radioactive isotope for biology medicine. And it happens at the end of 1938 that Hahn and Strassman discover the fission process. It takes no more than 2 days for my father to prepare a very simple experiment giving a physical proof. It was not aware that fish has given nearly immediately physical proof. And he understood immediately that fission may be the way to induce reaction chains. At the end of his Nobel lecture, my mother presents the result on physics. He presents the result on chemistry, and he gives a conclusion. And the conclusion was, okay, now physicists are able to do many things, to use radioactivity for many things. One can think at a time where we will be able to produce some kind of chemical reaction able to transmit from one to the other, and you imagine a huge amount of energy which will be produced. That was the end of the Nobel Prize presentation. You understand that he immediately understood that uranium is a very heavy nucleus. It breaks into lighter nucleus. Neutrons must be emitted together. If you calculate the energy, it's obvious. So if you have several neutrons, you can expect a nuclear chain. It happens that 2 people in the lab, from the 2 people immediately interested in the subject, one was Kowarski, was not at all a specialist, but Alban was a specialist of neutron. He was aware of the discovery of fission by Hahn before my father. When you look at the experiment done by my father to prove that fission exists, as he have tried himself to find an experiment for that, he said. And when my father asked him to collaborate, this was a very good team. And within 3 months, they have proved that you have neutrons. They have proved that they were rather energetic. That energetic neutrons that was known before were, by Fermi especially, were not the best one. That it was necessary to decrease the energy of the neutron to have a chance to have more fission reaction. They have even things that, if you have to slow neutron, you have to do that in a matter not absorbing. You cannot, if you absorb the neutron, it's to recognize they give 4 no, 3, at that time 3 patents in France and 2 or 3 countries about production of energy, the question of not manner to spread the matter, and a possibility for an explosive produce. To tell the truth, the pattern about producing energy, it's a good pattern. The one about the possibility and explosive power, using normal, ordinary uranium, you need a huge system. Probably would have never, no possibility of working, certainly. What is must be said is that there was a French team working on that, and you have at Columbia in the States the team by Fermi. And the two were within 2 weeks the work of Paris. They were before, after. The Paris results were slightly before those of team by Fermi. So the team in Paris continued to work to increase their study, and in September the second France became in war, so the Ministry of Armament was very interested by the production of the idea of producing energy, because France have not so much. And they give money, and this was continued until the defeat. At which time my parents have a big decision to take. In fact, they were not together at that time. They left Paris, or they left this place together. But my mother was in very bad condition of health. She suffered of tuberculosis from the time of I was born. And this was with crisis, so evacuation was something very tiring. So on the trip to Bordeaux, where they were able to leave France, my mother has to stop in a place where one can take care of her. So my father was reached Bordeaux with Kowarski-Alban and the paper of the experiment and the heavy water needed for the project of a small atomic reactor, a pile, as it was said at that time. And finally, he decided not to go with Alban Kowarski and all the, not to go in England, not to leave France, with the idea that people have also to make something to be able, that the German will be defeated at the end, and that you need, during that time, to be able to maintain some science in France, to be able to do it again. And my father's family was from this part of France, near Strasbourg, Alsace, which became German in 1870. And the people of French, some come in French and others remain in Alsace. Among people very having feeling for France, but they think we have to maintain the fact that, okay, Alsace is French and Alsace became French again. You see, there is between the 40 years passed before the First War. And when my father at the second one said, I remain there, German will be defeated anyway. Some people claim he has said it will take 5 years. But I have heard him so many times speaking about Alsace and the fact coming France to Germany to France that I'm not sure that he can imagine the defeat so quickly, if I say. But the idea was the same.
So he stayed in Paris.
So they stayed, he come back. My mother was able to come back also. During the time of the war, it was very difficult for my mother because of her health. I see a number of hours obliged to rest, and it's begin to be very decreasing, and she was allowed to go to Switzerland for nearly 1 year to take care. She was operated to block one of the lungs. So I would say she saved her. She saved her. So she was when she was in Paris, she come to the lab, but not as before. It was not possible. She became very active after the war. After 2 or 3 years, I would say streptomycin. The discovery of streptomycin and penicillin and streptomycin used to cure tuberculosis changed her life for the 10 last years. Clearly. And she would have died before. So, and we arrive at this, very complicated period of the following of the Second War. I would say the idea of physicist was clearly, when it is possible, trying research again and having exchange between different countries, again, free exchange. This was a common idea during the 45, 46. We have to, there is this problem with atomic weapon and so on. So my father was first, after Paris was liberated, he became the director of the National Center for Research. The idea of having De Gaulle was very much convinced that it was necessary to develop atomic energy in France. The report of my father and a few others, knowing that you have Kowarski and others having work in Canada. And those prepare the starting point for what we call in French oui, the atomic energy, and he will become at the end the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. But in fact, the turning point for physicists was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's when you look at what happens immediately after, when it was announced, nobody knows exactly what happens. They know that the two towns has been destroyed by one bomb. So he was not surprised because he knows that there was those work in. And his comment about at the day, so the same day, hearing about that, we were in vacation in Brittany at that time. It was atomic energy will be used for the good of the society, of the good of the science, will have a useful application, and not only the bomb, and also to tell to French people that yes, this is a very important result obtained in the States, but the starting point of the Manhattan Project is not only an American work. You have also the French work. And he was not completely happy of the way the American government have behaved for him. He was unable to go to the States, for example, because, okay, he go to England, but to go to the States he could not do at the end of 1944. And there was this official report, the Smith report, telling the story of the Manhattan Project, and giving in an introduction in the beginning, summarizing the result from fundamental research, as there was nothing about in the report about the French result. They quote some result from Copenhagen on that, strictly nothing. So the reaction of my father, okay, we must explain that we have done something. And it's only later that the fact that if you imagine a new war with atomic bomb, it was really the future of mankind. Okay, the newspaper and radio came from the States and from England to Paris, and okay, they have connection between the physicists. A number of physicists, nuclear physicists, or chemical physicists, having taken part in the Manhattan Project, give statements advertising that the fact of with the atomic bomb, it was completely necessary to have agreement for peace, not to use them. And this was the case of a number of physicists. Some of them have, even before the bomb, proposed that one give a demonstration of the bomb, but not using the bomb on the civilian, on the population. Those with Frank and a few others, with Stiller and a few others, there was a small number, but after the bomb is there, the number of physicists saying the same thing. You have to take care of that. And the statement by Einstein, who was not involved in the Manhattan Project itself, he was the man having given who have said to Roosevelt that something has to be done about the chain reaction and the atomic possibility of the German having it, but he was not involved at all in the Manhattan Project itself. And the statement was, with this situation is the future of all mankind. And the only possibility that this doesn't happen is to turn to a world government. Which is not so surprising. It's exactly the things he said after the First War, as a pacifist, very much engaged. So his reaction was more than the approach, more realistic, it has to be said. We must be able to control more or less that in order not to have a war with atomic weapons. But Einstein was, okay, if you have not a world government, this will happen a day or another. And that idea, he pushed it very bold sometimes. The bomb is really a turning point in the life of many nuclear physicists, among them my father. I would say the general opinion of nuclear physicists, more or less thinking about the future, was you need to avoid a nuclear war. Absolutely. But the situation was such that very quickly the combination of the need for a peace, based of no atomic weapon, and developing science as before with liberty. Because this was completely opposite to what was needed to have science again. And you find in the statement not only on my father saying that in Paris, but the other were saying that in the other country. You cannot, it's the end of, not only the end of the civilization if we have an atomic war, but it is the end of science if we are not able to have the condition for fundamental research and freedom of idea all among the world. So the two questions became mixed together. And for the last one, a statement by Einstein about the law I was telling about, turned to those people saying that the law was good. Science is international. Gentlemen, whatever you like that or not. I like the statement very much. And it's that. So, it happens that in July 1946, United Nations opened a special discussion, diplomatic and scientific discussion about the way of applying nuclear energy for useful purpose and controlling the produce of armament, of atomic arms. You have diplomats and you have scientific experts. My father, as the High Commissioner of Atomic Energy in France, was one of the experts starting this discussion in the States in July and in September, and all that after that continued during 2 years without real result. But in July, it starts with a report from America, from the States. If a report has been prepared by the scientists knowing the situation, American scientists. They have prepared the Lilienthal report. And taking the Lilienthal report, the diplomats and governmental people have taken what they want and introduced a number of things. It happened the secret about the bomb. The bomb must remain at one only place, which is the States, in spite of the fact that physicists state to everybody who will hear that there was no secret of the bomb, that a big country will be able to make atomic bomb. Okay, some say 1 year, but 10 years, it will last the last time. And both say 3 or 4 years, which was exactly what happened. And the diplomats, they were in between two choices. The security of the states rely on the fact that we are the first, and we have to remain the first. And we had bomb. We built more bomb and more bomb. Or the security of the state will rely, as for the other country, on an agreement. And you cannot prepare agreement when you take steps to war. And so when the discussion occurred in this commission, diplomat and scientist, I hear my father commenting to my mother, okay, if scientists were alone, we will find a solution. And also, if I look at the position of the Soviet Union and of the States and of the United States, you can pick in one some of the proposals, and you can find in the other one some proposals which are more reasonable than others. The situation after this period, I would say, other strictly political problem and history and all that result in the fact that this main problem, you have to be one side or the other. You cannot be on the middle side thinking really to the fact that, okay, the state could think, okay, the Soviet Union have their army in Europe are very near, and Russia on the other one, as many physicists point, okay, they have more reason to fear the United States. That United States I have to fear Russia. So it's another story after. But the way scientists were able to decide what to do. My father was engaged rather quickly in the Federation, the World Federation. FMTS, the World Federation of Scientific Workers. Okay, not only to fight again the possible use of bomb, but to try to develop not only atomic energy, but all kinds of science. Science as a social function. That idea didn't come especially from my father. It comes in particular from a book written by Bernal, the very well-known English scientist Desmond Bernal, and his book, The Social Function of Science. My father, I read it, I'm sure, and many others also. So it was that. We cannot speak of all the story of what happens until the death of my parents. My father, okay, first focused on what the scientist can do. But after 1 or 2 years, he convinced himself that, okay, scientists alone were not enough to push on this problem. So really, you must involve the public, the other citizens. So that is the reason we pushed him. We're trying ways to motivate people for that. And there's a way, if finally I was in this Greek World Congress for Peace in 1949, we were a number, and the year after there was this Stockholm apple given in Stockholm to have to adopt a clear position saying to forbid any use of bomb and to say we must find a way to control. And this was signed by many, many, many people. But I would say the political situation was such that people read what is stated here and here, adding many other considerations. Okay, I think they are true. They are. This is really their position because of reasons which have nothing to do. And it was the same thing one side and the same thing the other one. It takes time. It's a pity because in the state or even in England, more in the state, but people don't understand at all the position of my father as a scientist. And my father don't understand the position of others. And unfortunately, it happens that hydrogen atomic bombs became to be produced. This time it was only 1 year between the States and the Soviet Union, and the bomb from the Soviet Union was somewhat better, it seems. Okay, and you produce that, and you have this use in the atmosphere, and you have radioactive product everywhere on the Earth, and accident, and so on. And so the discussion among physicists start again here and here and here. And this in 1955, Einstein, what is known as the Einstein-Russell Declaration, which for the first time start with 11 signatures, one only in France, who is my father, with agree, especially with Russell, Bertrand Russell saying, I am anti-communist completely, and you are communist. It's the reason we have to sign that together. It was the last declaration of Einstein, as it is known. At the time, this was a special year, because at the time the declaration was made public. There was at the same time the conference in Geneva with a number of physicists invited, not my parents. And there was this story, there was even, and the French were the worst in that, because there was an exhibition to remind the progress of science before the war, and all that. There was nothing on the work of the Joliot-Curie. Nothing. Not a photograph, nothing. And it was told, many people did that Otto Hahn, visiting that exhibition, told them, because there was a photo of him, if you don't have something, put I wish that you take my photograph out. After, things the situation became better for my parents. Because of, the world was hope to find agreement. And my mother was in good condition in 54. She was in good condition, and she decided it's impossible at the Radium Institute to build accelerators. So we need a new place to do that. And she started all the necessary things to have a new institute in the south of Paris. She found a place at Orsay, which is now the place of Université Paris South. And when she died in 56, my father take the job there after and finished. And when he died, the institute was finished. We have a cyclotron working just. The last thing my father has done was to be the president of the International Congress of Nuclear Physics, which was in France that year, 58. Okay, like that.
Marvelous, my. We have some time to talk a little bit about yourself.
There was a problem with a woman, the lower level of the position of French women compared to men when I start research, but hopefully at that time nobody speak about. And nobody speaks so much about Pierre and Marie Curie. My parents a little more because it was nearer. No, they were alive. I didn't start. I start research, and after having made the physics and chemistry school, and having begin to be a researcher at the National Center for Research. Hopefully, I say nobody speaks so much about the Curie. So I was a searcher like the other. This was like that for a time. Not completely was like the other 10 years after. Because, for example, the institute start to have exchange with Harwell in Great Britain. And one physicist from Harwell has spent 3 months in our lab, and it was decided that I will spend 3 months in Harwell, at the place where they have the same synchrocyclotron as we have, so it was very useful for me. And they have made all the papers, the physicists of this lab have made all decisions necessary for me to have this position for 3 months there. And it happens that they were obliged in a letter to explain me that I could not have, because my mother will not be allowed to visit Harwell in 48. As I was the daughter of the Joliot-Curie, I was not allowed to work at Harwell for 3 months. So the discrimination against women, I don't think about that at all. But I met political discrimination, which is amazing. Amazing. I remember it was in the 80s, something like, maybe before. I was in the States. Each time I go to the States, I have to ask special thing. I have to explain that I will not kill the president of the States, everything, and explain at which point I will visit in the States. Okay, it was like that. There was a conference, and the physicists have arranged to have a new important lab with a very beautiful new accelerator at Los Alamos. At the conference, I have not asked to visit Los Alamos. But the director of that new lab, I met him at the conference I was attending in San Francisco, told me, I will be very happy that you give a talk at our lab at Los Alamos. I explained, okay, okay, I have not written that, and I am not sure that I am the best person to go to Los Alamos. Oh, he said, yes, you are especially the best person, because I wish to give a demonstration that the lab, this lab in Los Alamos, is as free as anyone in the university anywhere, and that it doesn't have condition. You are okay. So he really wished that I come there, because people were fearing to go. Oh, I will have to give explanation and all that. So I give my talk there. Everything was very well prepared, and it was true this time. We were in normal time, even at Los Alamos.
That's great. Wonderful.
Voilà.
Oh, that was quite, you have such a rich history. You have such a rich story to tell, and you did a great job.
Yes, but you see, the number of women, I was saying previously, the students in science were very, very small at the beginning of the century, but it was increasing. When, after the Second War, the number of women in science were not very large, depending on the place. But it happens that in physics, and especially in fundamental nuclear physics, it was not so bad. I would say, I never count again exactly, but maybe 20%, 25%, which is not so bad if you think to the situation now in several places. So I enter in a field where women, you find women in France, in the Scandinavian country, a few in Spain and in Italy, especially in physics, astrophysics and all that. Very few in the States, very few in Great Britain. When I come to an international conference on nuclear physics, okay, we are looking for the women, and okay, we've don't met colleagues from some of the country much advanced in those fields. I would say in Great Britain, in the labs of nuclear, even in nuclear physics, maybe the number of women were not more than in the time of Rutherford. Who are women at different level coming in his lab? So women, okay, in the best front of science. Mais c'est ça. C'est extraordinaire. Why Spanish women or Italian women and not German women? Never. Nearly never. It's the worst. Like that. So, as in France, in comparison, the situation were not so bad. I was, okay, 30, 50, we have money in the institute. Okay, I was not a professor, but I became a director of research, which is the same level. I met, or we have also met, in the team, we work, our team, we have 2 women in this team, maybe 3 in this other one. So it was not something, and when the question became come on the table in the 80s, because it's the 80s, so I, as other women, older women, we start to look around. And looking around, we were forced to say that, okay, there is discrimination against women. Yes. I remember when the discussion come from above to down. And the CNRS said, is quota of women, would it be good to put quota on the number of women? Quota on this position or this position. This is a kind of thing most human of my age we don't like quota. But at the end, the government start in the state also to give some women very important official position at the head of the thing. And things improve more or less in intermediate levels. But around, when you look at scientific researchers, is one thing, but when you look abroad, more also other workers, I understand that the situation was much worse. Much worse. I have this was a turning point for me. It was in the 80s, and there was a Polish delegation of scientists invited in France, a very important Polish delegation. And the Minister of Research invited very important scientists of France to meet for an official dinner, not dinner, but meeting at the ministry. And I was invited. Bon. And okay, there was, we were maybe 20, 25. And it was the kind of things he start to be discussed, but probably he has not think as a situation. Somebody start about the women in science. Alors, one speak, and everybody was, okay, seems to agree that more women. I say, I have something to say. And okay, when I said something, it was, look around the table. I am the only woman. And in addition, I know very well for what reason I am here. I am here because I am the granddaughter of Marie Curie. It was obvious. But for me, they were like that. But for me, it was an experiment because I have never seen that at that point. Scientists representing France and Norway, Poland and the other meeting, and not one woman. After that, I each time I come in a meeting, I estimate the number of women and men. And when in 1998, there was the International Conference for Nuclear Physics was in France. I was retreat at that time. I was asked, it was a celebration of 100 years after the discovery of polonium and radium. So I was asked, normal ID, I was asked to give the after dinner talk of the conference. Okay. So it was to speak about Pierre and Marie Curie. It was quite normal. But my ending point was the following. I have shown there a number of, I have a PowerPoint, I have one photograph and another one, and I finished by the Solvay conference in '33. In this conference, you have probably about 20 Nobel Prize or physicists who will have the Nobel Prize after. And you have three women, Marie Curie, Irène Joliot-Curie, and Lise Meitner. 33. And I told, if you take a picture of the president and invited speaker of this conference on nuclear physics in 1998, you will not have more women compared to men than in '33. It was the end of my talk about Pierre and Marie Curie. I think that even for that, it was worth to take this to speak this after dinner talk. There is something to change in the state of nuclear physics. This was my conclusion. Like that.
Well, it just makes it even more remarkable. It's even more remarkable that both your grandmother and your mother were the Nobel Prize winners, 2 of the 3 women.
Yes.
It's remarkable.
Yes, in 33, it's not bad. In 1911, Marie was alone. 33, there were 3. So if you extrapolate, you will have to solve the problem, level up and not change. And I feel that presently it is what happened. It was, I see things improving since 1890. It's improved, but for the last 5 years, my feeling is it is stopping. I am not sure, in fact I am convinced, for example, that the way science is developing now is the reason for that. Competing, having necessary to take 3 postdoc positions to get a chance to have a stable position, and that is worse and worse. Yes, this is difficult, more difficult for women than for men, even if things are slightly improving in the way you share the work at home, which is true, things are improving. But really, I think that things are leveling. Doesn't change. And I discussed with others, and they said me the same thing.